tall adjustment here. There we go. It's the fourth Sunday in Lent. I feel like I made it too tall. Does that ever happen? But our lessons today are really giving me Epiphany vibes. It threw me into sufficient confusion that while I was trying desperately to come up with some kind of Lent-appropriate story to tell to start this reflection off, all I could think about was a story about St. Francis of Assisi, whom we always celebrate on his feast day in October. So much for my great enthusiasm for the church calendar, y'all. St. Francis is perhaps best known to us for his approach to all God's creatures, great and small, and his penchant for preaching the good news to the birds of the field. Maybe we also know him as the son of a wealthy merchant who embarked on a campaign to disavow the pursuit of wealth and promoted instead the practice of simple, humble living in service to the world. Like many of us, Francis had a crisis of faith in his 20s, and the catalyst that propelled him from being a wealthy scapegrace to living as an impoverished ascetic was a moment of epiphany regarding his ingrained revulsion towards lepers. In the late Middle Ages, and in Jesus's day, and probably, let's be real, in our day as well, it was common to hold lepers in contempt and to cast them out of society. But one day, Francis's eyes were opened to the humanity of the lepers in his midst, and he became able to recognize them as fellow children of God. He realized that he and the able-bodied society in which he lived were more in need of healing than the lepers who had been cast out. So he ran out and embraced a leper in what had to have been a super weird hug. And you know, it was just a hop, a skip, a jump from there to apostolic poverty and shouting at birds. Our lengthy gospel lesson this morning comes from John, you know, the woo-woo gospel. Like, if we anthropomorphized our four canonical gospels and imagined them as guests at a cocktail party, Matthew would come in vintage. He'd be in a three-piece suit or like a slinky cocktail dress, right? And maybe Luke would be wearing a more modern, slim-cut suit or a little black dress. I figure Mark would have a sport coat or a blazer on over a pair of dark jeans and a t-shirt. But John would walk in one of those inflatable T-Rex costumes and just be like, here I am. John does not care about blending in. I think it's helpful to decide from the start how you're going to approach John's gospel. And so for me, I usually look for the ways Jesus demonstrates, illuminates, if you will, the nature and character of God through his actions and ministry on earth. For the past few weeks, our gospel lessons have provided us glimpses of Jesus's encounters with people, from his late night chat with Nicodemus to his midday encounter with the woman at the well, and finally to this episode involving a man who was born blind. The encounter unfolds with a bit of wordplay. Jesus sees a man who was born blind, which is a little on the nose. But also, is there really a visible difference between someone who was born blind and someone who loses their sight throughout their life due to illness or injury? It's not like the man was wearing a shirt. Baby, I was born this way. The disciples also see the long-term nature of the man's blindness, but their sight is not as good or as right or as true as Jesus's, and they are unable to see past the blind spot of their own prejudice. The wordplay throughout the story invites us to question the nature of sight, to ask ourselves if we are capable of seeing as clearly as Jesus, the kind of sight that gets right to the heart of things. Or do we see like the disciples and the Pharisees, on the surface only, or clouded by our ingrained beliefs about worthiness, our fear, our own darkest impulses to grasp at belonging at the expense of others. So you know how a dark comedy will make you laugh at things that you know you really should not find funny? This story is full of that kind of thing. There is something intensely funny about the disciples being the ones to show off all of their bad theology in front of Jesus. And then there's this hilarious comedy of errors after Jesus heals the man, and none of the man's neighbors can recognize him as a person because they've become so accustomed to seeing only his blindness. There are 3 rounds of questioning involving the man's neighbors, the religious elites, and even the man's own parents, and none of them can listen or recognize the truth of his testimony. But while all of those things are funny on the surface, the truth at the heart of the story is anything but. Did you catch the moment where the man's own parents prioritize their position in the community over their sons? He's of age, ask him, they said, fearful of the religious authorities' stated intention to throw anyone out of the synagogue who gave credence to Jesus as the Messiah. So their son gets thrown out, and they stay in. That's cold. Jesus' response to his disciples' wrong-headed and simplistic, ingrained theology, linking physical disability with sinfulness, with unworthiness, is compassionate. More than they deserve, really. And he's firm. Jesus asserts that sin is not the issue, and it is urgent to act according to God's values. And Jesus, the light of the world, will show us what those values are. So in a move that might remind us of one of the creation narratives from Genesis, Jesus mixes his own saliva with the dirt to make a clay to spread on the man's face, creating sight for this man who was born blind. He gives the man some instructions to follow, and the man does, and then he is able to see. I get the feeling that if the purpose of this story is a demonstration that what God wants for us is health and a perfectly able body, the story would end there. But you guys, this story is 41 verses long, at least in chapter 9, and it continues through the first 21 verses of chapter 10. It is 62 verses, you guys, and the man is healed at the end of verse 7. The story is about healing, sure, but I wonder if the man who was born blind is the only one who is offered healing that day. Maybe the promise of restoration was offered also to the whole community. Maybe, as St. Francis discovered, the community, the social fabric, is what truly needs to be healed. If only that were as simple a matter as spitting in the dirt and making up some clay. The ingrained theology that led the disciples to ask whether the man's blindness was a result of his own or his parents' sin, and kept them blind to the utter injustice of a child of God forced to live on the fringe of society, begging for food in order to survive. That's not just some quaint way of thinking that people used to do, but that we, as a more advanced society, have moved beyond. One only needs to look at the settlements of unhoused people, and more specifically at the people who walk or drive by those settlements and avert their eyes in order not to see the humanity of the people who live there. It is easier to ignore or deny their humanity, to tell ourselves that there are reasons why they are unhoused, why they are not worthy of our care. And it really is easier to try to find reasons not to care than to try to do something about the layers of inhumanity in our systems of healthcare, housing, policing, etc. I include myself in this as well. I frequently feel paralyzed by the uncertainty of which action to take, how I can best respond to the call of my faith and the broken world in which we live. Do I follow Francis's example and just run around giving out hugs? Is direct action the better move?
Yeah.
Am I really doing enough when I stand here at this pulpit and talk about how the good news involves a challenge of moving towards full, abundant life for everyone? How those of us who follow Jesus are on the hook for following his example. It is so easy to get caught up in the anxious fear that I'm not doing enough. But I take comfort in this story. Jesus heals the man, and he exposes some of the destructive elements of society. He corrects his disciples, and he challenges the religious elites. But Jesus does not manage to fix everything. I came into this world for judgment, Jesus says in John's Gospel. And that sounds terrifying if we leave it there. But he goes on to say, so that those who do not see may see. And he continues in chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. Jesus, light of the world, illuminates by his words and actions the path toward true sight. Jesus, the good shepherd, calls us to turn away from ingrained prejudices and bad theologies that might be easy and yet are unfruitful works of darkness because they destroy the community. We are children of the light. So let us spend the remainder of our Lent looking for things that are good and right and true, that lead toward abundant life for every person. And let's try to spend less time worrying about our inability to fix everything. Thanks be to God.